Banks' interference exposed. Demand action to save communities. And G20 meetings prove we were lied to. Coming up on this week's episode of the Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report. It's the 18th of November 2022. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined today by Citizens Party founder and leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's Citizens Report, we're going to talk about a push for a proper parliamentary raking over the coals of what the banks have set up to be a farcical process in the way they tried to rig the Regional Banking Task Force, and we need an inquiry into the whole mess of what the banks are doing out there in regional Australia. And we're going to point out the obvious, Craig, about what's happened at the G20 in terms of how the smiling faces there contrast to all the hysteria of the last 5 years. And we're also in a bit of a hurry, so let's do this efficiently. I'm going to, before we get going though, remember to like the show, please. If you're not a subscriber, subscribe to it. Share the show widely to help us get around, and comment on the make comments in the comment section. That helps just to get the conversation going. Also, Craig, before we start, just a reminder about the inquiry into ASIC that's underway in the Senate, and these are inquiries. Some people might think our inquiries are talkfest. Well, it depends on what the people do, right? You engage with them and stop them. Don't let them be a talkfest. And in this particular case, the committee running the inquiry really, they've indicated quite strongly they want to hear cases. They want to hear submissions, all right? So this is a big inquiry. You've got till the 3rd of February to get your submissions in, but don't dilly-dally. The committee wants to hear your case. If you've had an experience with ASIC, and it's only by contrasting ASIC's public facade with the real-life cases of the people it's supposed to be regulating the system for, will the people who make the laws be able to see, okay, this is a failing system, we have to fix it, right? And you've got to make them more afraid of you than they are of the banks. So get involved in the inquiry, please, and we'll put the link below to the website. All right, Craig, let's get into it. Banks' interference exposed. Demand action to save communities. And what we're talking about is a bit of our theme of the last few weeks, what's happening to regional banks with the closures and the need for an inquiry. Now, I misled the audience last week, Craig.
Yeah, I know you did quite a bit, Robbie.
Quite a bit. I apologise for that. It was inadvertent. I told you last week that, shockingly, since the Regional Banking Task Force report was published on the 30th of September, 22 more banks have shut down. That's what I told you last week. I was wrong. 72 more banks have shut down. They've either shut down or their impending closure has been announced. 72. There's almost as many bank branches shut in the last 6 weeks as in the entirety of 2021, which is when it was so alarming that they convened the Regional Banking Task Force. Right, so this is a serious issue. This task force has given the banks the green light to go nuts on shutting their branches. They've taken it as the green light, and the consequences are dire. So we've been dealing with the Shire of Coober Pedy, Craig, because they're really cactus at the moment. I don't know if they have cactus out there, but they probably do.
Close to it.
Close to it. They have one bank, Westpac, a Westpac branch, and it's going to shut down in February, they've just been told. That means this is a town that relies on cash a lot for the tourist trade and the opal trade. The nearest bank to Coober Pedy will now be 540 kilometres away. Now, wait, there's more. On top of that, the communities north of Coober Pedy is right in the centre of South Australia. The communities north of Coober Pedy, like Marla, which has a licensed post office, which is 200 plus kilometres north of Coober Pedy, that community, They drive the hundreds of kilometres to Cooper to bank already. So now that they will be going 700, 800 plus kilometres, sometimes 1,000 kilometres to get to their nearest bank. And why would they need a bank? Well, that's where you get cash from that these communities need in order to transact. This is the middle of Central Australia, people, right? Now, as we showed last week though, Craig, the banks are lying about their reasons. They're claiming we are responding to the market. The market is moving away from cash and moving away from branches, and it's going to digital banking. That's what the banks are claiming, right? What we showed last week by their own figures is no, they are putting excruciating pressure on their staff, demanding that they sign up everybody who walks in a bank door to digital banking, and little old grandmas are leaving banks with pieces of paper that have their username and passwords on it and absolutely no clue what to do, except the day somebody calls up and says, oh, hello, this is so-and-so from such and such. You have a computer problem. I'm here to solve it. Oh, really? Oh, thank you very much. Now, turn on your computer. Oh, now, did you get a piece of paper from the bank with how you log into your bank account? Oh, yes. Can you please give us that info? No worries, right? Yep. That's what the banks are exposing people to by doing this. They are lying. They're claiming they're getting 90% of their customers registered, but only 25% are using it. The majority are not using it, yet they're lying they're just using the registration figure to say we can shut all these branches down. And they're not unprofitable branches, Craig.
No, well, Robbie, I did a presentation on Wednesday night to our members, and one of the key things is go back to the 1937 Royal Commission when Ben Chifley, the Treasurer and the Prime Minister of this country, wrote a dissenting report about exactly this thing. You know what he said? He said banking differs from any other form of business because any action, good or bad, by a banking system affects almost every phase of national life.
Yes.
A banking policy should have one aim service for the general good of the community. The making of profit is not necessary to such a policy. So he wanted to nationalise the banking system back then, because the principle that we stand for as an organisation of the idea of the general welfare of the population comes first. And guess what? Banks have no interest in this whatsoever, because they've been proven time and time again that when the economy needs credit the most, they contract it. Yep. And then they're prepared to speculate when it's in so-called better times. They'll speculate on anything that moves in order to make a buck.
Everything's always in their favour.
That's correct. Right? And that's what Ben Chifley said. And he wrote a dissenting report on this and nailed it. And that was in 1937. Haven't we learnt yet?
That was can I say, that was a really good inquiry, the 1937 Banking Royal Commission. What's extraordinary is we're having this conversation now just after the government conducted an inquiry called the Regional Banking Task Force. But that task force is what has given the banks the green light. And big surprise, why? Because they ran the task force. There were 11 representatives on that task force, members of the task force. 8 of the 11 represented banks. 8 of the 11. That's what the government, the Morrison and government set up as a task force. And what's worse though, Craig, you got a union, which is affiliated with the Labor Party, the Finance Sector Union. They criticised this task force. They called it for what it was. They called it an election stunt. They said this is garbage what this task force is doing. Yet the new Albanese government took the task force findings as if it were its own and published them. And why would they do that? Well, we're putting out a press release today where we've posed the question, would they do that because maybe Anna Bligh, one of their own, a Labor person, is the head of the Banking Association, which is the lobby for the banks, which wants the green light to do what they're doing? And see, Craig, let me just explain something about the main feature of Australia's banking system. It's an oligopoly, right? Now, so to understand that, you know what a monopoly is? A monopoly means that business has a captive market. You don't have a choice apart from that business. An oligopoly is 2 or 3 businesses basically work together, and it's the same kind of captive market.
Well, they operate as a monopoly together, but
exactly.
They get different choices.
So because there's a few of them, you call it an oligopoly, right? So yeah, they control 80% of the market. So yeah, there's 20% on the fringes, etc. But they're much smaller financial institutions, and unfortunately, they don't count in this regard. And so what the banks know that when they're shutting down these branches everywhere, they're taking advantage of their status as an oligopoly because you're a captive market and there's really not that much you can do unless we get up a postal bank and provide an alternative, of course, which we'll talk about in a minute. That's what they were taking advantage of with this regional banking task force, and that's what Anna Bligh represents. And they control the Liberal Party. They gave them $14 million in donations in the last 9 years. But they also gave the Labor Party $9.5 million in donations in the last 9 years, Craig. And this is not charity, right? They expect something for that money, and they're getting it. And them publishing this is an example. Now, we went looking through the Regional Banking Task Force inquiry, and what we noticed is this report that was handed down, which entirely gave the banks a green light. There were a bunch of submissions where the people making the submissions called them out and said, what are you doing? You're assuming that this is legitimate, that the banks are shutting branches, and it's legitimate that regional Australia shouldn't have banking services. The premise of this task force is rubbish. And the kind of criticisms came from the Law Society of New South Wales, the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman, Australian Retailers Association, Banking Code Compliance Committee, Combined Pensioners and Superannuants Association New South Wales. Berwick and Shire Council was a really hard-hitting submission on this matter. They opened by saying, why is the task force consulting on objectives focused on legitimising regional and remote bank branch closures? Right, so they knew what the game was. All of those submissions were ignored in the final report. Right, this was something that the government and now the former government and now the Labor Party allowed the banks to completely rig this process. So, what's happened is this week, two experts, real experts in this subject, Dale Webster, the independent award-winning journalist who has spent the last few years of her life documenting extensively how bad the problem is out there. She has teamed up with Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, someone we collaborate with quite regularly, but Martin is a banking consultant and a banking expert. They've written to the Senate Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport Committee requesting that they open a new inquiry that the Regional Banking Task Force should have been, but wasn't because the banks rigged it, right? A proper parliamentary inquiry to look at the problem of bank branch closures properly, following on from the last time they did an inquiry like this in 2004, right, 18 years ago. But also look at the way this Regional Banking Task Force was set up. And they posed some, I want to read out some of the questions that they've posed in the letter that need to be questioned about this Regional Banking Task Force, that the banks could be allowed to rig a public parliamentary process like they have, right? So they call these serious issues of propriety around the establishment, conduct and impact of the Regional Banking Task Force, including the invitation extended to the banking industry to be involved in setting the terms of reference of an investigation into its own commercial activities, the banks and banking industry taking part in a consultation on which they would ultimately be instrumental in writing a final government report, giving them unprecedented control of the government narrative of this issue, imbalance in representation on the task force, with banks significantly outnumbering representatives of affected communities and stakeholders, misalignment of community expectations in the task force's agenda, failure to consult appropriately, including face-to-face opportunities and the lightning consultation period allowed for written submissions, use of the task force to consult on objectives focused on legitimising regional and remote bank branch closures, the use of the final report to push bank agendas for closing branches, interference in the final report to provide a solution to legal issues being faced at the time by a number of banks in relation to the misreporting of government data, impact of a tainted report now being part of the government record and being used by the banking regulator to justify inaction on serious breaches of the Financial Services Collection of Data Act 2001, and finally the acceleration of branch closures since the task force report was released on September 30, 72 regional branches in 6 weeks. Those questions themselves are quite damning to show you this was a very, very flawed process, right? And I'm conscious, Craig, when we talk about stuff like this, there's a tendency in all of us, including the listeners, to think, well, tell us what else is new. The whole system's corrupt. Well, of course it is, because give us the benefit of the doubt. Half the reason it's corrupt is because of our ignorance, right? What did you say once? We've got to shift the fridge,
Yeah.
right?
You can shine a light on the cockroaches underneath.
Shine a light on the cockroaches.
Otherwise, I'll just happily live there.
Exactly. That's what this process is, right? We've got to be involved. You can't. We may be starting late in the game potentially, right? But we've got to shift the fridge. Let the cockroach scurry, so we can see what's actually going on.
I think
and
that
the
process,
public being engaged is very important.
But also, Robbie, I think it's starting to take place in the Parliament itself, because I mean, you mentioned this week, which is good, that Malcolm Roberts back in 2019 began to actually take on the sacred cow of the Reserve Bank, and just started to shine the light on the Reserve Bank and demanded that they come into the Parliament and explain their actions. Now, I've been in this game, 34 years, and I've never seen this actually take place before, where the RBA, our central bank, is now being asked to explain itself as to what the policies are, because there's an entire hidden agenda here, which unfortunately many MPs aren't aware about, and that's the nature of public credit. And
well, let me set that up for you, because we want to play a clip. But before we do that, what we're asking the public to do is get behind this call by Dale Webster and Martin North for an inquiry. So we'll link to the press release below. Next week, Parliament's sitting. I'm going to be up there with Glenn Isherwood, talking to the members of Parliament about the need for this and the other issues we're on about. But the terms of reference that's been suggested for an inquiry, Craig, include looking at the case for a government bank to operate through the post office network, right? A government bank, that's the key, a public postal bank. And back to what you were saying, there has been this series of opportunities to question the RBA now. And last week was almost inadvertently, from a somewhat unusual quarter, the biggest doozy of all was asked, and the answer was quite revealing. Now the person who asked the question is Senator Matt Canavan. We're going to play the tape here. But before we do, Matt Canavan is the chair of the committee that we want to conduct this inquiry into what's happening with the regional banks and a postal bank, right? He's going to chair this committee. So bear that in mind when you watch him ask this question to the RBA, because what he's asking is relating to the RBA. The RBA, Craig, is a government bank. The government owns this bank, and you'll see that's relevant to the answer. And bear that in mind when we come back. We're going to talk about how that relates to our postal bank. Right? So what's the clip?
Now to Senator Canavan.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Ms Bullock. Ms Bullock, is the RBA bankrupt?
No, the RBA is not bankrupt. We can still continue to meet our operations and perform our operations and meet our debts and so on. So no, we are not bankrupt.
In your annual report, I'm sure you're aware, in the statement of your financial position, for 2022, you have net negative equity of $12.5 billion.
Yes, that's right.
I mean, on what basis are you, in a normal world, a going concern with net negative equity of $12.5 billion?
There's a couple of reasons. One is because we actually have the ability to create money, if you like, so we can continue to meet debts and we can continue to pay. The second reason is that ultimately the Reserve Bank is guaranteed by the government, and if you think about the $12 billion in the context of the government budget and GDP, it's actually very small.
I'll come back to that.
We're not.
I mean, you're probably aware, Mr John Keogh wrote in the Australian Financial Review that if the Reserve, this was on September 21st, I think when your accounts perhaps came out, he said if the Reserve Bank of Australia was a commercial bank or hedge fund, it would be bankrupt. So
Yes.
Do you disagree with that? Because it sounds like the only reason you're not bankrupt is because you can print money, and obviously a commercial bank can't do
Yes,
that.
because the central bank is not a commercial bank.
Yeah,
That is true.
All right. Craig?
Yep.
Take it away.
Well, Robbie, the last person that said that, what Michelle Bullock just said, was Denison Miller, that from what I know,
I agree.
publicly in about
who was he?
1912. He was the actual governor of the original Commonwealth Bank. The original Commonwealth Bank. Now, a little bit of history here. You know, he was approached after the war and he said, he was asked if it was true that the Commonwealth Bank had funded the war to the tune of £350 million. Now, think about it in today's terms. That's about $25 billion in today's terms, roughly speaking, right? And he said, yes, such was the case, and I could have financed the country for a further sum had the war continued. Right? And then he went on to say it was also available in peacetime. That sort of, where was the bank getting this sort of money? Well, Michelle Bullock let it out of the bag. Central banks, like the original Commonwealth Bank and now like the RBA, have the ability to literally print money. And what do they use? They use the wealth and the capital of the nation. Now that makes the central bank, the RBA, fundamentally different than any other commercial bank, but it also represents the power of our postal bank, the power of a national bank. So when Denison Miller set up the Commonwealth Bank, he did so with no capital.
Yep.
And everyone poured their money in. He was able to stop runs on the bank because of changing economic concerns during World War, when World War I broke out. And there was questions of the economy come up because of ships being blocked from Australia's trade being shut down and so forth.
But his quote was, very similar to Bullock's, but in a more explicit way, we are starting this bank without capital because we are backed by the full wealth and credit of the Commonwealth of Australia.
Exactly, and when the war came around, there was 10 bond issues to fund the war. It was all backed by the Commonwealth Bank. Those things were oversubscribed because the confidence that people had, because their bank was backed by the wealth of the nation, is where our postal bank derives its power. Now, this is the shocking thing that people have to realise. This is the nature of actual public credit.
Yep.
The public credit belongs to you, the people. It doesn't belong to the private banking system. The problem is that our politicians, unfortunately, not all of them, but most of our politicians don't get it, that they're in there representing the interests of, supposedly interests of the people, but in fact they're representing the interests of the banks because this fundamental issue of public credit is not taken on. It has in the past. By people like Curtin and Chifley knew this stuff, and they used it in World War II to save us.
This was the roaring debate for almost the whole of the history of Australia until Hawke and Keating came along.
Yeah, look, you have a look at the Rural Reconstruction Finance Corporation in the United States that Roosevelt used in order to fund the war and to take America out of the Depression. That was the equivalent, Robbie, of approximately $1 trillion. It wasn't part of the US budget. It was $1 trillion of public credit, which nearly all of it was paid back, except that which was written off to fund the war. But effectively, that public credit went into pulling out the United States from the Depression. And what people don't realise is that depression wasn't caused, that depression was caused deliberately because of the same policies we have today that restricted public credit, wouldn't allow the development of the economy. Instead, it went purely, anything the banks did went purely to speculation and to funding their own interests. And everything that was done to try and pull the economy out was done on the basis of trying to survive, to support the banks first and foremost, and everyone else just had to wait in line, and it never worked.
And Craig, importantly, in the comments, in the examples you've given, because Michelle Bullock and Matt Canavan both referenced the term creating money. And Michelle Bullock was explicit about that. And you've talked about creating money or printing money. People might initially think, well, oh, hang on, that has risk. Well, of course it does. But in every example you've given, that money was invested into the economy through productive means.
And that means the economy expands.
Yep.
There's more economic activities. Therefore, the money's paid back because the economy is growing.
Yep.
But when you talk about speculation, it just gets stuck into paper money. Nothing gets expanded. It's completely parasitical, and that's where the problem comes in.
Now, listen, I just wanted to highlight that around the time that, in the same hearing that Matt Canavan asked that question, Jared Rennick had asked a series of questions. We played some of it last week where he asked about the Bank for International Settlements, but before that, he asked about the RBA's free money to the banks, where they're using this. The power they have now to create credit, they've used to create hundreds of billions of dollars, create money, hundreds of billions of dollars that Jared pointed out that they have lent to the banks at either 0.1% or 0.25%. Those banks are free to re-lend that money at commercial rates of up to 6%. Or if they don't want to do that, they park it with the Reserve Bank overnight at over 3%. And so the money they've borrowed from the Reserve Bank at 0.1 or 0.25%, they're lending back to the Reserve Bank overnight at 3+%, right? This is free money. And so the point that, and Matt Canavan, we haven't played that part of the clip, but the point that both these guys made to the Reserve Bank is they're using this capacity that Michelle Bullock admits they have, not to fund infrastructure for Australians, but to fund the banks for their profits. And Martin North estimates the amount of money that ends up on the balance, on the profit and loss statement as pure profit is $6 billion. $6 billion a year. And we're asking these banks to stop shutting down branches that are costing them a couple of $1 million a year to totally severely disrupt the lives of their customers. Anyway, this is the nub of the issue,
yes.
right? There's a reason we've focused on this all along, and we're not just going after the bank's bad behaviour here because in its own terms, but because it exposes what you quoted Chifley before. And why we need the public option.
We need public credit. We need the wealth of our nation to be used as a means of investing in our nation.
Yeah.
That's all it is. It's that simple. But we don't want the wealth of our nation taken aside and given to the private banks to use in order to screw us and actually create war in the end because they're trying to protect their system.
100%. So, just before we move on, remember, click on the link below for the press release. What you need to do is call or email every senator in your state this weekend and early next week. Call them all, or email them over the weekend. Call them next week. Tell them you must support an inquiry into regional bank closures and a postal bank. Right, very, very important. And I'll be up there to walk the corridors of Parliament, Craig, and hear the phones ringing in all the offices as I walk past, knowing that it's people who've watched the Citizens Report, badgering members of Parliament, which is it's beautiful music to me. It drives them nuts, but that's good. Okay, let's move on because we're running short of time. G20 meetings prove we were lied to. And I've got to do this because, regular viewers of our show will know we've taken a tone. We have been the outliers in Australia. We've been the contrarians on the China issue. We've looked down this camera 100 times and said, this is garbage.
Only because, Robbie, the population's changed, not us.
Yes.
Look, there was a great deal of support for China going back to, 3 or 4 years ago. It's all changed because of the operation that's been run against China. It's principally out of the United States.
We were never happy that all our manufacturing moved over there as well.
No,
But China didn't steal it, right?
We let it go.
Nut jobs in our government outsourced it, and now they're outsourcing to other countries. Anyway, so it was always rubbish. So look at the photos, Craig. Look at Xi Jinping and Joe Biden. Look at those smiles. Look at Xi Jinping and Anthony Albanese and look at those smiles. And you tell me, haven't we been told for the last 5 years at least that Xi is essentially Hitler, that China is genociding? China's like the Nazis. They're genociding Muslims. They're harvesting organs from live victims. They're suppressing Hong Kong. They're invading the South China Sea. They're threatening the world. That's what we've been told. If that guy is the equivalent of Hitler, why are we smiling and shaking his hand? Because it's rubbish. Absolute, utter garbage. And it always was. You don't have to agree with everything that a country like China does, but the demonisation of the other, and it's China now, before it's been Russia for a long time, it was Iraq before we invaded it, it was Libya before we invaded it. The countries that we target for geopolitical reasons, we demonise them to death, and the public just sit there and let this stuff, pour into their ears, basically.
Which is what's happening with Russia right now and Putin, Robbie,
Exactly.
because the intention is not to allow Russia to develop and not to have the sort of collaborative relationship with other countries because this threatens the Western world. I mean, we're looking at an entire realignment of the world's financial and monetary system away from the US dollar now because countries look at the US and they look at having all their money in US bonds and stuff, and they say, well, if the US can step in and literally steal people's sovereign wealth, like country sovereign wealth, I don't think we want to have too much to do with them.
Exactly. And plus, when the US dollar became the reserve currency, Craig, it was the most powerful economy in the world by far.
And now look,
it does not. That America doesn't exist anymore.
No, you've got China's now risen to the number one position, and you have the whole BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, creating an entire new alignment, which many countries want to jump into. They don't want to jump into the bed with Western countries that are going for war and economic chaos and everything you see around the Ukraine war. You're just seeing a complete realignment.
Well, what I was interested in, apart from the fact that our government clearly wanted to have this meeting with Xi Jinping, and it went well, even though Anthony Albanese, it was a 32, thank God Biden and Xi had one for 3 hours, because that gave Albanese cover to have one for 32 minutes. He claimed to the press that he had this whole checklist of complaints about China's human rights he went through. I think he's lying, because they had a 32-minute meeting. If Albo was honest about going through that whole checklist of complaints, they wouldn't have had time for a meeting, right? These meetings are agreed to beforehand and the agenda's agreed to beforehand. This was Albo's way of placating the press, because the press is a bit slow to catch on in Australia. The general press actually accepted in the general media report in the TV news was, okay, that was reported as a positive, but you got sticklers like, I've got to read this headline out by Peter Harcher in the Sydney Morning Herald. He's been one of the biggest dirtbags in the media, demonising China to death on behalf of the intelligence agencies. He goes, headline, so this is what capitulation by a great power looks like, as if Xi Jinping and China capitulated to little old Australia. Craig, did this interview yesterday with Jerry Gray in China, and we talked about if you did a Venn diagram of China's trade and Australia's trade, it's like a penny farthing, right? And then where they overlap, the trade with each other, it's almost all of our trade and a tiny little 3% or something of China's trade. And we're pretending that China needed the meeting with us. We didn't need the meeting with China, right? Wake up and sniff the wind, people. This was our government realising that, hang on, we are getting carried away here with what we've done. And I bet you McGowan in Western Australia is in Albanese's ear all the time, because if China ever decides that they'll get their iron ore from somewhere else, right? Turn off the last person out of WA, turn off the lights. But I also wanted to highlight this. Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, who Albanese made a big deal about going over to him straight away to repair that relationship that Morrison screwed up. What has he come out and said yesterday? He has said Australia's decision to acquire nuclear submarines risks provoking a nuclear confrontation with China and strips the nation of its ability to independently defend itself. And that issue there is exactly what we have been jumping up and down with this stupid AUKUS deal. When you take in nuclear capacity in terms of weaponry, you become a nuclear target, and the same applies to the B-52 bombers up there. If Emmanuel Macron is one of those strategic partners we like talking about, if he can state it so blatantly, this is why we've been saying it. Our policy is causing the confrontation. China responds. We put the Marines in Darwin before China started building. The Marines in Darwin are called the tip of the spear. The US Marines are called the tip of the spear. In Darwin, they are so close to shutting off the Malacca Straits and choking China off from its oil. We did that in 2011. China responded in 2013 by starting to build up the islands, right? And then we turn around and say, oh, they're building up the islands. No, they are reacting every single time to what we and the Americans do. So now you've got someone of the stature of Macron saying exactly what we've been warning about as well. But I wanted to do this in a slightly different way, Craig, because I think we can present this more positively. Because I think, I want people to, don't just listen to Craig Isherwood and Robbie Barwick saying you've been lied to, right? If you pay attention, you can and look at it without prejudice, you can find the evidence out there of just what China is like. And we're going to now play a video. It's going to go for 8.5 minutes. We're going to end the show with this. But it's from one of my friends, Nuri Vitachi, who is a Hong Kong resident. He was also a New York Times journalist. He was actually a mainstream journalist. He wrote for the New York Times and all that sort of stuff. He was initially sympathetic to the independence movement in Hong Kong. And then as a resident, he saw how they were being lied to, right? And he's very effective in highlighting in these short videos he does what's actually happening in China and Hong Kong and those places. And this one he's talking to a wonderful woman named Tings Chak, and they're talking about China's poverty alleviation program. And it's in the 8.5 minutes. It gets into some detail, and you get the very keen sense of what's involved here, because the landmark figure, the headline figure, 850 million, is impressive. We always cite that 850 million, a billion people out of poverty. Let's watch how it was actually done in their description.
Hey, I'm here with Ting's Chat. Ting's Chat is a researcher with the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, right?
That's right.
We're going to talk about the biggest problem in the world, which is poverty, right?
In the last 4 decades, 70% of the world's poverty reduction, that's 70% of everyone who was taken out of poverty, was taken out of poverty in China. So that's a big contribution made by one country.
That is pretty amazing. So if you think about it, that means that the Chinese government, the hated, reviled Chinese government, has actually been the biggest contributor to rescuing the women, children and men of the world out of starvation level poverty and giving them food and shelter and dignity.
Absolutely. I mean, I think just to give kind of absolute numbers, it's hard to comprehend, but in the last 4 decades, 850 million people were lifted out of extreme poverty in China. I think it gets rarely reported on.
Yeah, I mean, it should be a huge thing. Like, if a white guy called Steve wakes up in Camden Town in London,
I know
right?
Steve.
Oh, you know Steve. Supposing some white guy anywhere wakes up and says, I found a way to solve poverty. Look, this is how you do it. A, B, C, bang. Surely the world would beat a path to his door and everybody would adopt those methods, but we don't see this happening. So why is that?
I mean, I think that's one of the reasons, as the Tricontinental, we wanted to do a study on the poverty issue in China, because it's one of the greatest stories of humanity ever, really. And it's a historic achievement.
Have there been any Western documentaries made on this topic?
Sure. I mean, I actually had a chance to talk with Robert Lawrence Kuhn, who's quite interesting. He spent a lot of time since the 80s going back between the US and China. He's actually a venture capitalist and saw the growth of China and saw the changes. And so he did a documentary really quite fascinating. It was a partnership between PBS, which is a public state media from the US, and then also CGTN, which is the English language or international public media in China. And together they did they went to the basically countryside to do a documentary on how the processes work, you know, who's in the countryside, who gets lifted out of poverty, what are the democratic processes in the grassroots level, which is quite interesting. Shortly thereafter, it got pulled off air in the US. It was de facto censored based on some editorial concerns. So there's also some interests, I think, in not talking about poverty or the alleviation of poverty, because somehow that might seem threatening to, you know, hear those stories from China.
Yes. Somebody might think, another government is doing their job better than we are, so we can't have that. What's the secret? What do they do?
Probably the most important is this 3 guarantees. So in order for someone to be considered lifted out of extreme poverty, you have to make sure you have access to compulsory and free education. In China, it's 9 years. Mm-hmm. You have access to basic medical health. And you have access to safe housing that has running water and electricity. So only when all these sort of indices come together, looking at a kind of multi-dimensional, multi-layered approach to poverty, then someone can be lifted out of poverty. So that is something that's probably quite, I think, innovative and new, that China contributed to the, you know, efforts around poverty reduction that have been happening around the world, but oftentimes aren't sustained beyond a particular program or particular funding that, you know, when it ends, people fall back into poverty. The second part is really sending people to the countryside to understand the realities of what's happening. So you have to go literally neighborhood to neighborhood, village to village, knock on the doors, and they sent 800,000 people from the party to actually knock on doors and assess.
They sent 800,000 people to knock on doors to find who was poor and where they lived.
Yep, and from there created a system of saying, okay, there are actually 100 million people still living under extreme poverty based on the set of measures I just mentioned. And then after that, they sent another 3 million people to go and live and work and pair with the families you know, one person might be paired with 5 families, and you stay and live in the countryside until, you know, you figure out, oh, what does, you know, Xiao Wang need, you know, to make sure he stays in school? What does, you know, the Auntie Zhang need so that, you know, she can deal with the fact that she has a disability and you know, can't work? And it's that level of you know, addressing poverty. That's why it's called, you know, precise or targeted poverty alleviation, because it was really looking at the specific cases, a human level, not a statistical level of, okay, we have 100 million people, okay, then let's send $100 million. It's not quite like that.
I mean, it's a tricky topic to make interesting, but I mean, the Chinese TV people did do it last year. They did a series called Mining Town, which was based on a true story, as they say. Did you watch it? They didn't broadcast it here.
Yeah, I definitely binge watched it. You laugh and you cry, and basically it's about, I mean, one of the party members being sent to the countryside and helping a very poor village. In this earlier phase of poverty alleviation in the kind of 80s period, you know, you have people migrating to the cities to work in the factories, but then you also have the, you know, the villages that needed a boost, you know, and in terms of production. So it was about mushroom farming. There's also reality TV shows too of, you know, celebrities going to the countryside, and it's just funny. There's like a lot of, you know, let's say pop culture also around this that helps kind of, I think, support the idea that this is a national project. So I think that's quite interesting. It's not just a government project, but also something that people support. If you ask an average person, they'll say, yeah, poverty alleviation is something to be proud of.
It's interesting that these studies of poverty alleviation, like Mining Town and these movies, are sometimes quite critical of the government too.
Also in the study, and also in Mining Town, it talks about questions of corruption. You know, there's a lot of, you know, we know that in China right now, corruption and anti-corruption is a big part. And there have been a lot of cases found around corruption, but it's also quite publicly announced and quite publicly addressed. And one thing that's really interesting about that documentary from Robert Lawrence Kuhn is that there is a whole system of, you know, third-party evaluation that happens. So to make sure that, you know, officials aren't doing, you know, aren't making an extra buck here and there, and so they send also brigades or groupings of students, university students that come. And there's a really interesting scene in the film, in the documentary, where the students are basically grilling the officials and say, okay, look at the books. We went to every house to check, and they do these random searches, and there's a whole kind of third-party way.
You know, someone sent me a video of taken in Xinjiang of the day the poverty alleviation official has to leave town. Yeah, and every village member, they'll line up to hug him, and you know, you can't fake something like that.
Yeah. I mean, if you've been living there, I mean, a lot of these people are sent to villages, they don't have existing connections, you know, and they might not even speak the local dialect. And you live there, you're far from your family, you miss home too, and you're there amongst the people for years. You build your relationships, and people build trust.
Wonderful. Okay, I've been talking to Ting Chak, who's written a wonderful book on poverty alleviation methods in China, full of data and statistics and detail about how it's done. Thank you very much, Tings.
Thank you, Neri.
Craig, that strikes me as a country that deserves credit and with which we as a country should want to cooperate economically. Would you agree?
Absolutely, Robert. What if we were to collaborate economically with China? Like, really collaborate, not this half-assed, you know, American ass-covering operation.
Yep.
I mean, there's one thing that strikes me. Albanese's been in government for 6 months, and Morrison was in government for 9 years. You can't, in terms of the slow workings of government, turn things around quickly. If what he did with this meeting with Xi is an indication that he's trying to turn this huge Queen Mary around in terms of policy, that's very good. However, we've got to stay on his case and make sure that there's no room for him to say, go back to the crap that we took up under Scott Morrison. It's in our national interest to collaborate and work with China. And what you see in that video is China. We've had people, our staff have gone to China. They've come back with the same stories. And, you know, China is not a pariah. It's simply following what we call the American system of political economy. It's directing public credit into large-scale infrastructure development, which is also health, it's also education, which is what you saw in that video, educating and bringing up and alleviating poverty. All of that's being funded.
And notice their metrics were not financial.
There were no
It's not
financial.
How much income you're getting.
No.
Do you have electricity? Do you have education?
Exactly.
What was the third
Physical economy.
one? Physical economy.
Physical economy in the point that this is what you do to empower an economy and bring it up. And this is what the West is terrified about. What China has demonstrated is the principles that we stand for, which is called the American system of political economy, not the crap that
It's
we've got
called
now.
that because they pioneered it in the
Back
1800s.
in, yeah, people like Alexander Hamilton were key in, writing reports on the power of
You saw
public credit.
you saw the musical
Yeah,
too
no,
the other day.
it
What
was,
did you think?
oh, it's excellent. I mean, I'm not one for rap music, but what I was really enjoyed was the detailed history
Yeah.
that ordinary people don't usually get. And I also love the idea of the demographics of the people that go there, because I do go to the occasional opera, and all you see is a sea of grey hair.
Oh, yeah,
but
yeah, okay.
not in the case of Hamilton, because you saw lots of young people. It was very well done. And like I said, I'm not a fan of rap, Robbie, but the point is that even I was able to look through the rap and the presentations and saw the depth and the creativity of what was being done. And that's really the key here. Look at the creativity of how it was presented and to learn something historically.
If you're Melbourne-based, so you're going to be in Melbourne between now and was it
I
February
think
or something?
early January.
January.
But then it's going to
Get
Brisbane.
along. Get along. Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Okay. Look, if you have an opportunity to go, get along to it. Now, look, very good. Just think about what you've just watched there. I'm going to put another link in the comments below, Craig, which is to the television show that they reference in that clip, where they dramatise this question of what's been involved in alleviating poverty in China, and it's on YouTube actually.
Is it?
It's English, and it's got English subtitles.
Oh, right.
So if you're interested in watching a Chinese-made drama, we'll put that link below, etc. Look at it without prejudice, right, and just say, okay, isn't this a way we can solve problems? And it's certainly commendable. So contrast that to all the lies you've been told for the last 5 years, that when it mattered, when it was really necessary, the government's just prepared to completely ignore them so they can have a meeting like they did this week.
If we were to truly trade with China in the way that we could, we are going to need public credit to expand our economy in order to take advantage of everything our country has. You take for 1 sec, think about the development of nuclear power. Look what we could do there in collaboration with the Chinese in order to provide vast amounts of cheap electricity.
Yep.
And that's one of the key things that was done, with the Commonwealth Bank. It funded local councils who were then responsible for electricity in order to provide cheap power for all the rural industries that needed it.
No, exactly.
I mean, the examples are just mind-blowing.
All right, Craig, got to run.
Yeah, Robbie.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks to the viewer for joining. Remember, make calls and emails about the regional banking inquiry. Tune in next week for more of the Citizens Report.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.